Chapter 46 of Memoirs of the Distinguished Men of Science of Great Britain, living in the years 1807 to 1808. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This is a recording by Megan Thomas. Memoirs of the Distinguished Men of Science of Great Britain, living in the years 1807 to 1808, by William Walker Jr. Chapter 46. Thomas Thomson, Doctor of Medicine and Fellowship of the Royal Society. Born April 12, 1773, died July 2nd, 1852. Dr. Thomas Thomson, Regius Professor of Chemistry in the University of Glasgow, who exercised a remarkable influence in the development and extension of the science of chemistry during the present age, was born at Crieff in Perthshire. He received his early education at the parish school of that place, and after remaining for a time under the care of Dr. Doig of Stirling, went to the University of St Andrews, where he remained for a period of 3 years. Thomson entered upon his medical studies at the University of Edinburgh, and during the session of 1795 to 1796 attended the lectures of the celebrated Dr. Black, who first awoke in him the latent taste for that science of which he was destined to become so bright an ornament. In 1796 he became connected with the Encyclopaedia Britannica, for an early edition of which he wrote the articles Chemistry, Mineralogy, Vegetable Substances, Animal Substances, and Dyeing Substances, etc. These articles formed the basis of his system of chemistry, which he published at Edinburgh in the year 1804 in 4 volumes, and afterwards greatly enlarged and improved as the demand for the book increased. Dr. Thomson commenced delivering a series of lectures on chemistry at Edinburgh in 1800, which were continued with increasing popularity until 1810. Meanwhile, he invented the system of chemical symbols, now generally adopted by all men of science, with variations as the time demands, and without which chemical language would be unintelligible. He was also the first to open a laboratory in Great Britain for practical manipulation in chemistry. In 1810 he published his Elements of Chemistry, and in 1812 visited Sweden, and on his return wrote a description of that country. The following year to this, Dr. Thomson started in London the Annals of Philosophy, a scientific journal which he continued to edit until the year 1822, and which a few years afterwards was merged in the Philosophical Magazine. He also, about this time, conducted for the Board of Excise a series of investigations on brewing, which formed the basis of Scottish legislation on that subject. In the year 1817, Thomson was elected lecturer on chemistry in the University of Glasgow, and in the following year received the title of professor. This chair he held until his death, being assisted in his latter years by his nephew and son-in-law, Dr. R.D. Thomson. When Dalton had worked out his grand discovery of the atomic theory, he communicated the result of his researches to Thomson, who at once perceived the value and importance of the discovery, and in the year 1807 was the first to publish it to the world. He gave a sketch of this grand theory in the 3rd edition of his System of Chemistry, and we are chiefly indebted to the labours of Professor Thomson, conjointly with Dr. Henry of Manchester and Dr. Wollaston, for luminous views on this important subject. In 1825, Dr. Thomson wrote, in 2 volumes, an attempt to establish the first principles of chemistry by experiment. In 1830 to 1831, he published his History of Chemistry, a work which has been described as a masterpiece of learning and research. In 1836 appeared his Outlines of Mineralogy and Geology, and in 1849 he issued his last work on brewing and distillation. Thomson performed in science, and its history in literature a very great amount of valuable labour, and acquired a distinguished reputation both as an original discoverer and as a practical teacher of his favourite science. He died in 1852 at the age of 79, and has left behind him a son who bears his name, now, 1860, superintendent of the East Indias Company's Botanic Gardens of Calcutta, and one of the most distinguished scientific botanists of the day. Encyclopaedia Britannica, 8th edition. English Cyclopedia, London, 1858. End of chapter 46. Thomas Thomson, Doctor of Medicine and Fellowship of the Royal Society.
Chapter 47 of Memoirs of the Distinguished Men of Science of Great Britain living in the years 1807 to 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Drew Brentson. Memoirs of the Distinguished Men of Science of Great Britain living in the years 1807 to 8 by William Walker, Jr. Chapter 47. Richard Trevithick. Born April 13, 1771. Died April 22, 1833. Richard Trevithick, inventor of the first high-pressured steam engine and the first steam carriage used in England, was born in the parish of Llywelyn in Cornwall. He was the son of a purser of the mines of the district, and although he received but little early education, his talents were great in his own special subject, mechanics. When a boy, he had no taste for school exercises, and being an only son, was allowed by his parents to do much as he pleased, so that most of his time was passed either in strolling over the mines amidst which he lived, or in working out schemes which had already begun to fill his youthful imagination, seated under a hedge with a slate in his hand. Trevithick was a pupil of William Bull, an engineer practicing at that time in Cornwall, employed in erecting Watt's engines, and who afterwards accompanied Trevithick to South America. When he had attained the age of 21, Trevithick was appointed engineer to several mines, a more responsible situation than the one held by his father, who, on hearing of his son's appointment, expressed great surprise, and even considered it his duty to remonstrate with the gentleman who had proposed the appointment. About this period, in 1792, he was also employed to test one of Hornblower's engines, and even before this had, with the assistance of William Bull, constructed several engines which did not come under Watt's patents. Trevithick's duties, as engineer at this time, frequently required him to visit Mr. Harvey's iron foundry at Hale, who was in the habit of inviting him to his house. This ultimately resulted in his becoming attached to Mr. Harvey's daughter, to whom he was married on the 7th of November, 1797. After his marriage, Trevithick lived at Plain-on-Carry in Redruth for a few months, then at Camborne for 10 years. From about 1808 to 1810, he resided in London, but after his unfortunate failure in attempting to tunnel the Thames, returned to Penponds in the parish of Camborne, where he lived for 5 or 6 years at the house of his mother, afterwards living at Byzance, from which town he sailed for Peru on the 20th October, 1816. While residing at Camborne, Trevithick, influenced perhaps by the success of Murdoch's model steam carriage, determined to build one adapted to ordinary road traffic. One Andrew Vivian supplied the pecuniary means and joined him in the project, for which, on its completion, a patent was taken out in 1802, and in the same year a small one was erected at Marazion, which was worked by steam of at least 30 pounds on the square inch above atmospheric pressure. Their steam carriage presented the appearance of an ordinary stage-coach on 4 wheels, having one horizontal cylinder, which, together with the boiler and firebox, were placed at the back of the hind axle. Mr. Michael Williams, late MP for Cornwall, in a letter to Mr. E. Watkins, dated the 5th of January, 1853, mentions having been present at the first trial of Trevithick's locomotive, and says, "The experiments made on the public road closed by Camborne were perfectly successful, and although many improvements in the details of such description of engines have been since effected, the leading principles of construction and arrangement are continued, I believe, with little alteration in the magnificent railroad engines of the present day." After making several satisfactory trials in the neighbourhood of Plymouth, Trevithick and Vivian exhibited their invention publicly in London, first at the Lord's Cricket Ground, and afterwards on the spot of ground now occupied by Euston Square. At this latter place, however, Trevithick, influenced by some curious whim, suddenly closed the exhibition on the second day, leaving hundreds waiting outside in a state of great wrath. Mrs. Humblestone, an old inhabitant of London, who at that period used to keep a shop near to the present Pantheon, Oxford Street, relates that she well remembers witnessing a public trial of Trevithick's steam carriage. On this occasion the shops were shut, no horses or carriages were allowed in the streets, and the roofs of the houses in the neighborhood were crowded with people who hurrahed and waved their handkerchiefs as the steam monster was seen coming along Oxford Street at a rapid pace. 2 years afterwards, Trevithick constructed the first successful railway locomotive, which was used on the Mather-Tydvil Railway in the year 1804. This engine had an 8-inch cylinder of 4 feet 6 inches stroke, placed horizontally as at present and working on a cranked axle, while, in order to secure a continuous rotary motion, a flywheel was placed on the end of the axle. When we add to this that the flywheel was furnished with a brake, that the boiler had a safety valve or a fusible plug beyond the reach of the engineer, and that the patent includes the production of a more equitable rotary motion, quote, by causing the piston rods of 2 cylinders to work on the said axis by means of cranks at a quarter of a turn asunder, unquote. It is scarcely too much to say that nothing material was added to the design of the locomotive until the invention of the tubular boiler in 1829. On the occasion of its first trial, on the 21st of February 1804, this engine drew carriages containing 10 tons of bar iron for a distance of 9 miles, at the rate of 5 miles an hour. The specification of the patent for Trevithick's steam carriage mentions a plan for causing the wheels, in certain cases, to take a stronger hold of the ground by means of sundry rough projections, but it also adds that, in general, the ordinary structure or figure of the external surface of these wheels will be found to answer the intended purpose, which appears to have been the case in the above-mentioned engine. After making a few experiments with his engine, Trevithick forsook the locomotive for other projects of his versatile genius, and this great invention was left to be perfected and carried into general use by George Stephenson. In the year 1809, Trevithick commenced an attempt at tunneling under the Thames. It was the second time that this difficult undertaking had been tried, Ralph Dodd having been the first of the unsuccessful borers. When a large sum of money had been raised by subscriptions, Trevithick commenced boring at Rotherhild, and in order to save both labour and expense, kept very near to the bottom of the river. But, notwithstanding the increased difficulties which he had to encounter on this account, he actually carried the tunnel through a distance of 1,011 feet, and within 100 feet of the proposed terminus. At this point, an unfortunate dispute arose between him and the surveyor appointed to verify his work, the surveyor ascertaining that the tunnel had been run a foot or 2 on one side. This reflection on his skill as an engineer excited Trevithick's Cornish blood, and he is said to have adopted the absurd expedient of making a hole in the roof of the tunnel at low water, and thrusting through a series of jointed rods, which were to be received by a man in a boat, and then observed from the shore. In the execution of this scheme, delays ensued in fitting the rods together, and at length so much water made its way through the gully formed by the opening in the roof that retreat became necessary. Trevithick, with an inborn courage, refused to go first, but sent the men before him, and his life nearly fell a sacrifice to his devotion. As he made his escape on the other side, the water rose with him to his neck, owing to the tunnel following the curve of the bed of the river, which necessarily caused the water to congregate towards one part. The work was thus ended almost at the point of its successful completion, being at once a melancholy monument of his folly and his skill. After this unfortunate failure, Trevithick commenced many schemes. Among others, his attention was directed towards the introduction of iron tanks and buoys into the Royal Navy. On first representing the importance of this to the Admiralty, the objection was raised that perhaps in the case of the tanks, iron would be prejudicial to the water, and consequently to the health of the crews. Trevithick was therefore requested to consult Abernethy upon the subject, which he accordingly did, and received for his answer the following characteristic reply: "That the Admiralty ought to have known better than to have sent you to me with such a question." He, likewise, about this period, contributed largely to the improvement and better working of the Cornish engines, and to him the merit is due of introducing into these engines the system of high-pressured steam, and of inventing in the year 1804 the cylindrical wrought-iron boiler, now known as the Cornish boiler, in which he placed the fire inside instead of outside, as had been the practice before his time. Trevithick also appears to have been among, if not the very first, to employ the expansive principle of steam. In the year 1811-12, he erected a single-acting engine of 25 inches cylinder at Hull Prosper in Gwythein, with a cylindrical boiler in which the steam was more than 40 pounds on the square inch above atmospheric pressure, and the engine was so loaded that it worked full 7/8 of the stroke expansively. In this he seemed to have preceded Wolfe by several years. It is also stated by Mr. Gordon in his Treatise on Elementary Locomotion that Trevithick was the first to turn the induction pipe into the chimney of the locomotive to increase the draught. We now come to the most romantic and stirring period of Trevithick's career. In 1811, M. Ouville, a Swiss gentleman at that time living in Lima, came to England to see if he could procure machinery for clearing the silver mines in the Peruvian mountains of water. Watt's condensing engines were, however, of too ponderous a nature to be transported over the Cordilleras on the back of the feeble llamas, and Uville was about to give the matter up in despair when, on the eve of his departure from this country, he chanced to see a small working model of Trevithick's engine in a shop window near Fitzroy Square. This model he carried out with him to Lima, and had the satisfaction of seeing it work successfully on the high ridge of the Sierra de Pasco. Uville now returned to England to produce more engines of the same kind, but he was a second time almost forced to give the matter up, for Boulton and Watt, the most distinguished engineers of their time, assured him that it was impossible to make engines of sufficient power, and yet small enough to be carried over the Andes. Fortunately, however, Uville at this point met with Trevithick himself, and was enabled to make such arrangements with him as resulted in embarkation, during September 1814, of 3 engineers and 9 of Trevithick's engines. On landing at Peru, Uville and his charge were received with a royal salute, and in due time the engines, which had been simplified to the greatest extent, and so divided as to form adequate loads for the weekly llama, were safely carried over precipices where a stone may be thrown for a league. An engine was soon erected at Laricocha, in the province of Tarma, which successfully drained the shaft of the Santa Rosa mine, and enabled working operations to be recommenced. During the year 1816, Trevithick, hearing of this success, gave up family and fortune and embarked for South America. On landing, he was received with the highest honors. All Lima was in a state of excitement, which rose to a still greater pitch when it was found that his engines, by clearing the mines of water, had doubled their produce and increased the coining machinery 6-fold. Trevithick was created a Marquis and Grandee of Old Spain, and the Lord Warden of the mines proposed to raise a silver statue in his honor. All went well until the Revolution broke out, when the Cornish engineer found himself placed in a very disagreeable position between the two parties. The Patriots kept him in the mountains in a kind of honorable captivity, while the Royalists ruined his property and mutilated his engines. Trevithick, never very patient, soon determined to end this, and after incurring many hardships and dangers, succeeded in making his escape from the oppressive love and veneration of the mountain patriots. On their way back, Trevithick and his companions encountered many perils. They had to shoot monkeys for subsistence, their clothes were almost always wet through owing to it being the rainy season of the year. They had also to ford rivers, and in many cases made their own roads by cutting down the underwood and other obstacles which impeded their progress. On one occasion, Trevithick nearly lost his life. In attempting to swim across a river, he became involved in a kind of whirlpool caused by some sunken rocks, and notwithstanding all his efforts, he was utterly unable to swim beyond its influence, which kept carrying him round and round. Fortunately, just as his strength was giving way, a companion, who had cut down a tall sapling, succeeded in stretching it out to his assistance, and thus drew him to land. Ultimately, after a long interval, Trevithick arrived at Cartagena, on the Gulf of Darien, almost in a state of utter destitution. Here he was met by the late Robert Stevenson, who, having just received a remittance from home, lent half to his brother engineer to help him on his way to England, where he arrived on the 9th of October, 1827, bringing back a pair of spurs and a few old coins, the sole remnants of the colossal fortune made, but not realized, in the Peruvian mines. Before this occurred, however, Trevithick had visited various parts of the west coast of South America. Part of this time he was in the company of Earl Dundonald, then Lord Cochrane, but the last 4 years of this period were spent by him at Costa Rica, in the countries now so well known as the route of the Nicaraguan transit and the scene of General Walker's filibuster warfare, where he projected mines and devised many magnificent schemes, but realized no permanent good for himself. Among other things, having discovered some valuable mineral deposits, he obtained from the government a grant of the land which contained them, and on his return to England succeeded, by his representations, which were confirmed by a Scotchman of the name of Gerard, who had been his companion, in organizing a company for sinking the necessary mines. Before, however, active operations were commenced, Trevithick one day entered the new company's offices to arrange finally about his own interest in that concern. A cheque for £7,000 was at once offered him as purchase money for his land in South America. This, however, was not what he had wanted, and without giving a thought to the largeness of the sum offered, he indignantly threw back the cheque across the table and walked out of the office. After this the company broke up, and Trevithick never realized a penny piece from his really valuable possessions in that country. After his return from America, but little is known of Trevithick. Late in life he commenced a petition to Parliament, in which he asks for some grant or remuneration for his services to the country, by reason of the superiority of his machinery, stating that from the use of his engines the saving to the Cornish mines alone amounted to £100,000 per annum. But before presenting this petition, he met with a moneyed partner, who supplied him with the means of perfecting his never-ceasing inventions. This was all Trevithick wanted, and the petition was consequently laid aside. Thus assisted, he obtained a patent in 1831 for an improved steam engine, and another in the same year for a method or apparatus for heating apartments, and a third on the 22nd of September, 1832, for improvements on the steam engine, and in the application of steam power to navigation and locomotion. This was the last patent he took out. He died at Dartford in Kent during the following year, at the age of 62. Trevithick, by his marriage with Miss Jane Harvey, had 4 sons and 2 daughters, all of whom are still living. His manners were blunt and unassuming, but yet possessed a certain kind of fascination which generally secured for him, in whatever society he might be, an eager and attentive auditory. In person he was tall and strongly made, being 6 feet 2 inches in height, and broad in proportion, and to this day stories of his extraordinary feats of strength are told among the miners of Cornwall. His life remains a record of constant but brilliant failures, and that from no inherent defect in his inventions, but solely from the absence in his character of that perseverance and worldly prudence necessary to bring every new undertaking to a successful commercial issue. Contributions to the Biography of R. Trevithick by R. Edmonds, June, Edinburgh New Philosophical Journal, October 1859. The Land's End District, etc., with brief memoir of Rick Trevithick, by R. Edmonds, London and Penzance, 1862. All the Year Round, August 4, 1860, and other particulars taken from original and authentic sources. End of Chapter 47. Recording by Drew Brentson.
Chapter 48 of Memoirs of the Distinguished Men of Science of Great Britain, living in the years 1807-08. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Memoirs of the Distinguished Men of Science of Great Britain, living in the years 1807-08, by William Walker, Jr. Chapter 48. Edward Troughton, F.R.A.S. Born October 1753, died June 12, 1835. Edward Troughton, the first astronomical instrument maker of our day, was born in the parish of Corney, on the southwest coast of Cumberland, and was the third son of a small farmer. An uncle of the same name and his eldest brother John were settled in London as mathematical instrument makers, and as his second brother was apprenticed to the same business, Edward was designed to be a farmer, continuing to be his father's assistant till the age of 17. The death of his younger brother, however, altered Edward's destination and caused him to be placed with his brother John, at that time a chambermaster employed chiefly in dividing and engraving for the trade, and the higher branches of the art. Under the instruction of John, who was an excellent workman, Troughton made very rapid progress, and at the end of his time was taken into partnership. About the year 1782, the Troughtons established themselves in Fleet Street, where they commenced an independent business, and soon rose into eminence. After the death of his brother John, Edward alone continued the business until the year 1826, when increasing age and dislike to routine employment induced him to take Mr. William Sims as his partner and successor. The instruments which facilitate navigation were peculiarly objects of interest to Mr. Troughton, and long after his infirmities were an effectual bar to the applications of his most esteemed friends, he exerted himself to supply the seamen with well-adjusted and accurate sextants. Your fancies, he would say, may wait, their necessities cannot. In 1778 he took out a patent for the double-framed sextant, a construction which, combining firmness and lightness, yet admitted of a considerable radius in this invaluable instrument. After trying and rejecting the repeating reflecting circle of Borda, Mr. Troughton in 1796 hit upon one of his happiest constructions, the British reflecting circle, as he delighted to call it, an instrument which in right hands is capable of wonderful accuracy. It is a characteristic trait of Mr. Troughton that in order to bring his favorite circle into general use, he reduced its price far below the usual profits of trade, and if he had succeeded in his attempt, he might have been ruined by his success, for his sextants were by far the most gainful article of his business. With the same earnestness to promote the interests of navigation, he invented the dipsector, afterwards reinvented by Dr. Wollaston, and expended time, money, and ingenuity to no inconsiderable amount in attempting to perfect the marine top for producing a true horizontal reflecting surface at sea. The marine barometer, the snuff-box sextant, and the portable universal dial owe to him all their elegance and much of their accuracy. Where others invented or sketched, he perfected. In the ordinary physical apparatus, Troughton made considerable improvement in the construction of the balance and of the mountain barometer. In the same class may be mentioned the form given to the compensated mercurial pendulum, his pyrometer, by which some very valuable expansions have been determined, the apparatus by which Sir George Shuckburgh attempted to ascertain the standard of weight and measure, and that apparatus which, in the hands of Francis Bailey, has given an invariable simple seconds pendulum. In the ordinary geodesical instruments, Mr. Troughton greatly improved the surveying level and staff, and reduced them both in weight and price, with increased convenience and accuracy. It is, however, in the construction of astronomical instruments that this great mechanician particularly excelled. Here he reigned without a rival. His portable astronomical quadrants are models of strength and lightness, while the repeating circle of Borda, an instrument which he disliked, first received its beauty and accuracy from his hands. The ordinary reading micrometer and the position micrometer, commonly employed in the measurement of double stars, were greatly improved by him in simplicity and brought to perfection, and he first applied the former to dividing, though in circles and scales it had already been used in reading of. Mr. Troughton's larger works, such as his equatorical instruments, circles, transits, etc., are as well known in the astronomical world as those of Wren in the architectural. They are too numerous to mention here, and are distributed in various parts of the world. The gigantic zenith tube at Greenwich was about the last work on which he was engaged, and he had just time to finish it before his strength failed. The only astronomical instrument which is not greatly indebted to Mr. Troughton is the telescope, and he was deterred from making any attempt into this branch of his art by the curious physical defect of color blindness, which existed in many members of his family. Like Dalton, he could not distinguish colors, and had little idea of them, except generally as they conveyed the impression of greater or less light. The ripe cherry and its leaf were to him of one hue, only to be distinguished by their form. With this defect in his vision, he never attempted any experiments in which color was concerned, and it is difficult to see how he could have done so with success. The most remarkable of Troughton's writings are An Account of a Method of Dividing Astronomical and Other Instruments by Ocular Inspection, etc., Phil Trans, 1809, which was awarded by the Copley Medal; A Comparison of the Repeating Circle of Borda with the Altitude and Azimuth Circle; Memoirs R. Est Sos, and several articles in Brewster's Edinburgh Cyclopedia, such as Circle, Graduations, etc. In the year 1825, Mr. Troughton paid a visit to Paris, and in 1830 he received an honorary gold medal from the King of Denmark. During the latter portion of his life he became almost entirely deaf, only hearing by the aid of a powerful trumpet. He died at his house in Fleet Street, June 12, 1835, in the 82nd year of his age, and was buried at the cemetery Kensal Green. Monthly Notices of the Royal Astronomical Society, Volume 3, February 1836. End of chapter 48.
Chapter 49 of Memoirs of the Distinguished Men of Science of Great Britain living in the years 1807 to 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Memoirs of the Distinguished Men of Science of Great Britain living in the years 1807 to 8 by William Walker, Jr. Chapter 49. Richard Watson, Bishop of Llandaff, Doctor of Divinity, Fellow of the Royal Society, etc. Born August 1737. Died June 4, 1816. Richard Watson, celebrated both as an able theologian and as a professor of chemistry, was born at Haversham, near Kendal in Westmoreland. His ancestors had been farmers of their own estates for several generations, and his father, a younger son, was for 40 years the headmaster of the grammar school at Haversham, but had resigned his duties about the period of the birth of his son Richard. Young Watson received his education at this school, and about a year after his father's death, in 1753, was sent on an exhibition of £50 belonging to the school to Trinity College, Cambridge, where he was admitted as a sizar on the 3rd of November, 1754. All he had, besides his exhibition, to carry him through college, was a sum of £300 which his father had left him, but he set bravely to work to make his way to independence by hard study and hard living. His dress is said at first to have been a coarse, mottled Westmoreland coat and blue yarn stockings. May 1757 he obtained a scholarship, and in the September following, while still only a junior soph, he began to take pupils, continuing to be employed, first as private and then as a college tutor, until in October 1767 he became one of the head tutors of Trinity College. Meanwhile, Watson had taken his degree of B.A. in January 1759, being classed as second wrangler, which he seems to have considered, and not without reason, as a place of honor for the year, the senior wrangler, who was a member of St. John's, having, as it was generally believed, been unfairly preferred to him. In October 1760 he was elected a fellow of his college, and in November 1764, on the death of Dr. Hadley, he was unanimously elected by the Senate to the professorship of chemistry, although at that time he knew nothing of the science. Watson did not, however, disappoint the confidence that was placed by others in his abilities. With the assistance of an operator, whom he immediately sent for from Paris, and by shutting himself up in his laboratory, he acquired such an acquaintance with his new subject as to enable him in about 14 months to read his first course of lectures, which were honored with a numerous attendance, and proved highly successful. Other courses followed, which were equally well received, and in 1768 he printed a synopsis of the principles of the science under the title of Institutiones Metallurgicae. Watson was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1769, and for some years afterwards contributed many chemical papers to the Philosophical Transactions. In 1771 he published an essay on the subjects of chemistry and their general divisions. In 1781 he published 2 volumes 12mo of chemical essays. A third appeared in 1782, and a fourth in 1786 completed the work, which has often been reprinted, and was long very popular. In connection with his chemical professorship, Watson obtained from government, by proper representations, a salary of £100 for himself and for all future professors. He also paid some attention to theoretical and practical anatomy, as having a certain relation to the science of chemistry. In October 1771, on the death of Dr. Rutherforth, He unexpectedly obtained the lucrative and important office of Regius Professor of Divinity, and in that capacity held the rectory of Somersham in Huntingdonshire. At this time he had neither taken his degree of B.D. or D.D., and by his own account seems to have known little more of theological learning than he did of chemistry 7 years before. Yet such was his good fortune, or the reputation that he had established, for carrying an object whenever he took it in hand, that no other candidate appeared for the professorship, while his eloquence and ingenuity supplied the want of deeper erudition, and attracted as numerous audiences to the exercise in the schools at which he presided, as had ever attended his chemical lectures. Watson himself, in the anecdotes of his life, gives the following account of this circumstance. "I was not, when Dr. Rutherford died, either bachelor or doctor in divinity, and without being one of them I could not become a candidate for the professorship. This puzzled me for a moment. I had only 7 days to transact the business in, but by hard travelling and some adroitness I accomplished my purpose, obtained the king's mandate for a doctor's degree, and was created doctor on the day previous to that appointed for the examination of the candidates. Thus did I, by hard and incessant labor for 17 years, attain at the age of 34 the first office for honor in the university, and, exclusive of the mastership of Trinity College, I have made it the first for profit. I found the professorship not worth quite £330, and it is now worth £1,000 at least." Watson's clerical preferment after this was very rapid. In 1773, through the influence of the Duke of Grafton, he obtained possession of a cynosure rectory in North Wales, which he was enabled to exchange during the course of the following year for a prebend in the church of Ely. In 1780 he succeeded Dr. Plumtree as archdeacon of that diocese. The same year he was presented to the rectory of Northwold in Norfolk, and in the beginning of the year following received another much more valuable living, the rectory of Knaptoft in Leicestershire, from the hands of the Duke of Rutland, who had been his pupil in the university. Lastly, in July 1782, he was promoted to the bishopric of Llandaff by the prime minister of that period, Lord Shelburne, who hoped thereby both to gratify the Duke of Rutland and also to secure an active partisan. Watson, however, proved a very unmanageable bishop, and during the course of his political career was singularly free and independent in his sentiments. One of his first acts was to publish in 1783 a letter to Archbishop Cornwallis on the church revenues, recommending an equalization of the bishoprics. This he did in spite of all that could be said to make him see that it would embarrass the government, and at the same time do nothing to forward his own object. And so he continued to take his own way, and was very soon left to do so without any party or person seeking either to guide or stop him. In 1783 Bishop Watson had married the eldest daughter of Edward Wilson of Delham Tower in Westmoreland. In the year 1789 he retired from politics and betook himself to an estate which he had at Calgarth, on the banks of Winandermere, occupying himself in educating his family and in agricultural improvements, especially planting, for which he received a medal from the Society of Arts in 1789. Previous to this, in 1786, his friend and former pupil, Mr. Luther, of Ongar in Essex, had left him an estate which he sold for more than £20,000. Bishop Watson died on the 4th of June, 1816, in his 79th year. His writings are very numerous and miscellaneous in their character. Some of the more well-known are An Apology for Christianity, written in 1776 in answer to Gibbon; a Collection of Theological Tracts selected from various authors for the use of the younger students in the university, in 6 volumes, 8vo; 1785. Apology for the Bible in a series of letters addressed to Thomas Paine, 1796, and An Address to the People of Great Britain, which went through 14 editions, 1798. One of the best practical results of his chemical studies was the suggestion which he made to the Duke of Richmond, at that time Master of the Ordnance, respecting the preparation of charcoal for gunpowder by burning the wood in close vessels, a process very materially improving the quality of the powder, and which is now generally adopted. Anecdotes of the Life of Richard Watson, Bishop of Llandaff, written by himself, London, 1817. Memoir by Dr. Thomas Young, Encyclopaedia Britannica, English Cyclopedia. End of chapter 49.
Chapter 50 of Memoirs of the Distinguished Men of Science of Great Britain, living in the years 1807 to 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Availle in June 2020. Memoirs of the Distinguished Man of Science of Great Britain, living in the years 1807 to 8, by William Walker, Jr. Chapter 50. James Watt, Doctor of Laws, Fellow of the Royal Society, Law and Economics, etc. Member of the French Institute. Born at Greenock on the Clyde, 1736. Died August 25, 1819. To James Watt, philosopher, mechanician, and civil engineer, whose genius perfected the control of one of the greatest revealed powers yet given to man, may well be applied the saying of Wellington, "That which makes a great general makes a great artist, the power and the determination to overcome difficulties." Born with a sickly temperament, and prevented thereby from attending school, or indulging in the usual healthy play of children, Watt, unassisted by others, devoted his time to study, and in retirement and reflection laid a foundation of knowledge destined to bear such ample fruit. In addition to mere book knowledge, he early exhibited a partiality for mechanical contrivances and operations, and this determined him to commence his career as a mathematical instrument maker. For this purpose he set out for Glasgow in 1754, but owing to the limited resources of the town at that period, he finally decided on going to London, where, after great difficulty, he was apprenticed for a 12-month to an instrument maker in Finch Lane. At the end of his apprenticeship, Watt, having become enfeebled from over-attention to work, repaired to Greenock to recruit his health, and ultimately returned to Glasgow, where he was established by the authorities within the precincts of the college as mathematical instrument maker to the university. In process of time, Watt's shop became a favorite resort for professors as well as students, and he counted among his visitors Professor Simpson, Doctors Black, Dick, and Moore, but his most intimate friend, and the one most closely connected with his afterlife, was John Robison, a student at Glasgow, afterwards Professor of Natural Philosophy at Edinburgh University, to whom the honour is due of having first directed Watt's attention to the steam engine. The event which actually led to the commencement of his invaluable discoveries on this subject was the entrusting to him the repair of a small model of Newcomen's engine, which the college possessed. In his endeavours to put this engine into working order, Watt was led to investigate thoroughly the properties of steam, upon which its action depended, and ultimately, in the spring of 1765, after many trials and untiring perseverance, he arrived at the great and simple idea of a separate condenser into which the steam expanded, thereby preventing that wasteful expenditure of heat which was the necessary result of the old plan of condensing the steam in the working cylinder by admitting a jet of cold water directly under the piston. In addition to this, Watt surrounded the cylinder with a second casing to be filled with the surplus steam, for the purpose of preventing radiation of heat, and closed in the top, which in Newcomen's engine had been left open for the sake of the pressure of the atmosphere upon the piston, by putting a cover on, with a hole and stuffing box for the piston rod to slide through, a plan which enabled steam pressure to be used in place of atmospheric. Newcomen's engine, at this time used only for pumping out water in mines, thus became a true steam engine of immense power, capable of being worked with economy, and of being turned to the various uses to which science has since applied it. For these great improvements a patent, dated January 5, 1769, was taken out by Watt and Dr. Roebuck, the founder of the Carron Iron Works, with whom Watt had become acquainted. Little, however, was done for some years in manufacturing engines on a large scale. Roebuck fell into difficulties, while Watt, harassed, depressed in spirits, and in want of money, was forced to obtain employment as a civil engineer and land surveyor. Among the many works that he was engaged on in this capacity may be mentioned the Crinan Canal, afterwards completed by Rennie, the deepening of the River Clyde, improvements in the harbours of Ayr, Port Glasgow, and Greenock, the building of bridges at Hamilton and Rutherglen, and lastly, surveying and estimating a line of canal between Fort William and Inverness, which was subsequently executed by Telford on a larger scale than was then proposed, under the name of the Caledonian Canal. In the latter half of the year 1773, Roebuck's affairs came to a crisis, and Watt, through the agency of Dr. Small, having been brought into relation with Mr. Bolton, a man possessing an intimate knowledge of business, with extended views and a liberal spirit of enterprise, an arrangement was entered into between them, and the firm of Bolton and Watt established at Soho. This was the turning point in Watt's fortunes. Under the vigorous management of Bolton, his great invention at length began to be appreciated, and the saving of fuel was found to be nearly 3/4 of the quantity consumed by Newcomen's engine. In 1775 an extension of the original patent until the year 1800 was obtained. This gave a fresh stimulus to Watt's fertile brain, and resulted in patents being taken out between the years 1781 and 1785 for the rotatory motion of the sun and planet wheels, the crank having been pirated by Wasbrough, the expansive principle of working steam, the double engine, the parallel motion, the smokeless furnace, the float to regulate the supply of water into the boiler, and the governor. At a later period, Watt also invented the indicator, by means of which the actual horsepower of an engine could be ascertained. This beautiful series of inventions in a measure may be said to have perfected the machine, and at the present time the condensing steam engine differs in no material respect from the engine as Watt left it. While residing at Birmingham, Mr. Watt's house became the resort of many learned men. In the meetings of the Lunar Society, held at Soho House, originated his experiments on water, and between him and Cavendish is the honour divided of having first promulgated the theory of its composition. During the dispute which arose upon this subject, Watt's reply, on a friend regretting that another should have carried off this honour, is worth recording, as showing the modest dignity of his character. "It matters not," said he, "whether Cavendish discovered this or I. It is discovered." In the year 1800, Mr. Watt, having acquired an ample competency, ceased to take an active part in the business of the firm, and the remainder of his life was spent in retirement, but his active mind, still unwearied, continued to follow its natural bent. On 2 occasions afterwards, in 1811 and 1812, he gave proofs of the undiminished powers of his inventive genius. In the one instance he was induced, by his grateful recollections of his residence in Glasgow, to assist the proprietors of the waterworks there with a plan for supplying the town with better water, by means of a suction pipe laid across the Clyde to reach to the other side, where water of a very superior quality might be procured. This pipe was formed of cast iron, with flexible joints, after the manner of a lobster's tail, so as to accommodate itself to the bed of the river, and fully answered the purpose for which it was designed. In the other instance he was prevailed upon, by the earnest solicitation of the Lords Commissioners of the Admiralty, to attend the deputation of the Navy Board, and to give, with his friend Captain Huddart and Mr. J. Jessop, an opinion upon the works then carrying on at Sheerness Dockyard, and the further ones projected by Messrs. Rennie and Whitby. On this occasion he no less gratified the gentlemen associated with him by the clearness of his general views than by his knowledge of the details, and he received the thanks of the Admiralty for his services. In 1814 he yielded to the wishes of his friends, of Dr. Brewster especially, and undertook a revision of Professor Robison's articles on steam and steam engines for an early edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, which he enriched with valuable notes, containing his own experiments on steam and a short history of his principal improvements upon the engine itself. Among other mechanical contrivances of Mr. Watt's may be mentioned a machine for copying letters, an instrument for measuring the specific gravity of fluids, a regulator lamp, a plan for heating buildings by steam, and a contrivance of drying linen. In his 83rd year Mr. Watt was still occupied in inventing a machine for copying statues, but this remained unfinished. Death arrested his hand. He died in the year 1819 at Heathfield in Staffordshire, and thus, full of years and honours, ended the life of a man who, though born in a secluded village town and reared in comparative poverty, was yet enabled, by persevering industry and the happy gifts of nature, to contribute so greatly to the commercial prosperity of the world. Mr. Watt was elected a member of the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 1784, of the Royal Society of London in 1785, and a corresponding member of the Batavian Society in 1787. In 1806 the honorary degree of Doctor of Laws was conferred upon him by the spontaneous and unanimous vote of the Senate of the University of Glasgow, and in 1808 he was elected, first a corresponding and afterwards a foreign member of the Institute of France. A few years before his death it was intimated to him, by a message from Sir Joseph Banks, that, to use the words of Mr. Meyerhead, the highest honour usually conferred in England on men of literature and science, namely a baronetcy, was open to him, should he desire it. But, although Watt felt flattered by this intimation, he determined, after consulting with his son, to decline the honour. 5 statues have been erected to the memory of this illustrious man, of which number the one in Westminster Abbey, by Chantrey, bears on its pedestal the famous inscription by Lord Brougham, "Not to perpetuate a name which must endure while the peaceful arts flourish, but to show that mankind have learned to honour those who best deserve their gratitude. The king, his ministers, and many of the nobles and commoners of this realm raised this monument to James Watt, who, directing the force of an original genius, early exercised in philosophical research to the improvement of the steam engine, enlarged the resources of his country, increased the power of man, and rose to an eminent place among the most illustrious followers of science and the real benefactors of the world. Born at Greenock, 1736. Died at Heathfield in Staffordshire, 1819. Meyerhead's translation of Arago's Historical Eloge of James Watt, London, 1839. Memoir by his son J. Watt, Encyclopaedia Britannica. Quarterly Review, October 1858. End of chapter 50.
Chapter 51 of Memoirs of the Distinguished Men of Science of Great Britain, living in the years 1807-1808. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Memoirs of the Distinguished Men of Science of Great Britain, living in the years 1807-1808, by William Walker, Jr. Chapter 51. William H. Wollaston, Doctor of Medicine, President of the Royal Society, etc. Born August 6, 1766. Died December 22nd, 1828. William Hyde Wollaston was born at East Dereham, a village 16 miles from Norwich. His father was an astronomer of some eminence, who, in the year 1800, published an extensive catalogue of the northern circumpolar stars. After a preparatory education, Wollaston entered at Caius College, Cambridge, where he took the degree of Bachelor of Medicine in 1787 and that of Doctor of Medicine in 1793. Soon afterwards he became a Tancred Fellow. During his residence at Cambridge, he devoted himself more to the study of astronomy than any other science. On leaving Cambridge in 1789, he settled at Bury St. Edmunds and began to practice as a physician, but met with so little success that he soon removed to London. Shortly after his arrival, he became a candidate for the office of physician to St. George's Hospital, but was defeated by the election of his principal opponent, Dr. Pemberton. It is stated that this circumstance had such an effect on Wollaston that he declared, in a moment of pique, he would abandon the profession and never more write a prescription, were it for his own father. This statement is, however, contradicted in a biographical notice of him, contained in the reports of the Astronomical Society, where it is affirmed that he continued to practise physic in London to the end of the year 1800, when an accession of fortune determined him to relinquish a profession he never liked, and to devote himself entirely to science. On the 9th of May, 1793, Wollaston was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, and in June 1797 appeared his first contribution to the Philosophical Transactions, being a paper on gouty and urinary concretions. From this period until his decease, Wollaston was a constant contributor to the Transactions, as well as to various scientific journals. His papers in the Philosophical Transactions amount to 39, and, in addition to strictly chemical subjects, include memoirs in astronomy, optics, mechanics, acoustics, mineralogy, crystallography, physiology, and botany. On the 30th of November 1804, he was elected Junior Secretary to the Royal Society, and on the death of Sir Joseph Banks in June 1820, succeeded him in the President's chair until the anniversary, November the 30th of the same year, when he retired in favour of Sir Humphrey Davy, to whom, at the election, he gave the whole weight of his influence. In the years 1804-1805, Wollaston first made known to the world the existence of the two metals, palladium and rhodium, which he found were contained in the ore of platinum, associated with osmium and iridium, two metals discovered about the same time by Mr. Tennant. In 1809 he showed that the supposed new metal, tantalum, was identical with columbium, previously discovered by Mr. Hatchett, and shortly before his death he transmitted to the Royal Society a communication, constituting the Bekerian lecture of 1828, in which he fully describes his ingenious method of rendering platinum malleable. From this invention he is stated to have acquired more than £30,000. Dr. Wollaston's knowledge was more varied and his tastes less exclusive than any other philosopher of his time, except Cavendish. But optics and chemistry are the two sciences in which he made the greatest discoveries. To him we owe the first demonstration of the identity of galvanism and common electricity, and the first explanation of the cause of the different phenomena exhibited by them. Dr. Wollaston was accustomed to carry on his experiments in the greatest seclusion, and with very few instruments. He was also endowed with an extreme neatness of hand, and invented the most ingenious methods of determining the properties and constituents of very minute quantities of matter. It is related by Dr. Paris, in his Life of Davy, that a foreign philosopher once calling on Wollaston with letters of introduction, expressed a great desire to see his laboratory. "Certainly," replied Wollaston, and immediately produced a small tray containing some glass tubes, a blowpipe, 2 or 3 watch glasses, a slip of platinum, and a few test tubes. Another anecdote is told of him that, having been engaged one day in inspecting a monster galvanic battery constructed by Mr. Children, he accidentally met, on his way home, a brother chemist, who knew of Mr. Children's grand machine, and uttered something about the inconvenience of it being of such an enormous size. On this, Wollaston seized his friend by the button, led him into a by-corner, where, taking from his waistcoat pocket a tailor's thimble which contained a galvanic arrangement, and pouring into it the contents of a small phial, he astonished his friend by immediately heating a platinum wire to a white heat. He also produced platinum wire so extremely fine as to be nearly imperceptible to the naked eye. Towards the close of the year 1828, Wollaston became dangerously ill with disease of the brain. Feeling his end approaching, and being unable to write himself, he employed an amanuensis to write accounts of such of his discoveries and inventions as he was unwilling should perish with him, and in this manner some of his most important papers were communicated to the Royal Society. It is a curious fact that, in spite of the extensive cerebral disease under which he laboured, his faculties continued unclouded to the very last. When almost at the point of death, one of his friends having observed, loud enough for him to hear, that he was unconscious of what was passing around him, Wollaston made a sign for pencil and paper, and then wrote down some figures, and after casting up the sum, returned the paper. The amount was found to be correct. Dr. Wollaston died on the 22nd of December, 1828, at the age of 62, only a few months before his great scientific contemporaries, Sir Humphrey Davy and Dr. Thomas Young. He was buried in Chislehurst churchyard, Kent. Dr. William Henry gives the following summary of his character. Dr. Wollaston was endowed with bodily senses of extraordinary acuteness and accuracy, and with great general vigour of understanding. Trained in the discipline of the exact sciences, he had acquired a powerful command over his attention, and had habituated himself to the most rigid correctness both of thought and language. He was sufficiently provided with the resources of the mathematics to be enabled to pursue with success profound inquiries in mechanical and optical philosophy, the results of which enabled him to unfold the causes of phenomena not before understood, and to enrich the arts connected with those sciences by the invention of ingenious and valuable instruments. In chemistry he was distinguished by the extreme nicety and delicacy of his observations, by the quickness and precision with which he marked resemblances and discriminated differences, the sagacity with which he devised experiments and anticipated their results, and the skill with which he executed the analysis of fragments of new substances, often so minute as to be scarcely perceptible by ordinary eyes. He was remarkable, too, for the caution with which he advanced from facts to general conclusions, a caution which, if it sometimes prevented him from reaching at once the most sublime truths, yet rendered every step of his ascent a secure station, from which it was easy to rise to higher and more enlarged inductions. Wells' History of the Royal Society, with Memoirs of the Presidents, London, 1848. Sketches of the Royal Society, etc., by Sir John Barrow, Baronet, Fellow of the Royal Society, London, 1849. End of chapter 51.
Chapter 52 of Memoirs of the Distinguished Men of Science of Great Britain, living in the years 1807 to 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Memoirs of the Distinguished Men of Science of Great Britain, living in the years 1807 to 8 by William Walker, Jr. Chapter 52. Thomas Young, Doctor of Medicine, Fellow of the Royal Society, etc., Member of the Institute of France. Born June 13, 1773. Died May 10, 1829. Dr. Thomas Young, celebrated for his universal attainments, was born at Milverton, in Somersetshire. He was the eldest of 10 children of Thomas and Sarah Young. His mother was a niece of Dr. Richard Brocklesby, a physician of considerable eminence in London. Both of his parents were members of the Society of Friends, and to the tenets of that sect, which recognizes the immediate influence of supreme intelligence as a guide in the ordinary conduct of life, Dr. Young was accustomed in after years to attribute in no slight degree the formation of those determined habits of perseverance which gave him the power of effecting any object upon which he was engaged, and by which he was enabled to work out his own education almost from infancy, and with little comparative assistance from others. At the age of 2 years, Young could read with considerable fluency, and before he was 4 years old had read the Bible through twice, and also Watts's hymns. He was likewise from his earliest years in the habit of committing to memory pieces of poetry, in proof of which there exists a memorandum, written by Young's grandfather, on the margin of a copy of Goldsmith's Deserted Village, to the effect that his grandson Thomas had repeated to him the whole poem, with the exception of a word or two, before he was 5 years old. In 1780, he was placed at a boarding school at Stapleton near Bristol, and here the deficiency of the instructor appears to have advanced the studies of the pupil, as Young now became his own teacher, and used to study by himself the last pages of the book taught almost before he had reached the middle under the eye of the master. In the year 1782, he became an inmate of the school kept by Mr. Thomson at Crompton in Dorsetshire, remaining there nearly 4 years, during which period he rapidly acquired knowledge upon various subjects. Having commenced the study of botany, he was led to attempt the construction of a microscope, with the assistance of an usher in the school of the name of Benjamin Martin, in order to examine the plants he was in the habit of gathering. In his endeavors to make the microscope, Young found it necessary to procure a lathe, and for a time everything gave way to a passion for turning. This was, however, at length succeeded by a desire to become acquainted with the nature of fluxions, and after reading through and mastering a treatise upon this subject, he turned his attention to the study of Hebrew and other Oriental languages. Ultimately, at the age of 14, Thomas Young was more or less versed in Greek, Latin, French, Italian, Hebrew, Persic, and Arabic, and in forming the characters of these languages, had already acquired a considerable portion of that beauty and accuracy of penmanship, which was afterwards so remarkable in his copies of Greek compositions, as well as those subjects connected with the literature of ancient Egypt. A story is related of him that when requested a few years later by a friend of Dr. Brocklesby, who presumed somewhat upon Young's youthful appearance, to exhibit a specimen of his penmanship, he replied by writing a sentence in his best style in 14 different languages. In 1787, Young was engaged, in conjunction with Mr. Hodgkin, as private tutor to Hudson Gurney, grandson of Mr. David Barclay of Youngsbury near Ware in Hertfordshire, and he remained thus occupied during the space of 5 years, extending his knowledge as far as possible. The number of books he read through at that time was comparatively small, but whatever book he began to read, he read completely and deliberately through, and it was perhaps this determination always to master what he might happen to be engaged on before attempting anything else, which enabled Dr. Young to attain so great knowledge on such various subjects. He himself had little faith in any peculiar aptitude being implanted by nature for any given pursuits. His favorite maxim was, that whatever one man had done another might do, and that the original difference between human intellects was much less than it was supposed to be. In this respect, he resembled his great predecessor Newton and his contemporary Dalton, both of whom had unbounded confidence in the powers of patient thought. In the autumn of 1792, Thomas Young removed to London, in order to study medicine, which profession he had determined to adopt, being greatly influenced in his choice by the wishes of his uncle Dr. Brocklesby. This gentleman had kindly undertaken the charge of his education, and Young was by him introduced to the members of the most distinguished literary circles in the metropolis, including Burke, Drs. Lawrence and Vincent, Sir Joshua Reynolds, Sir George Baker, and others. In the autumn of 1793, he became a pupil at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, and in October 1794 proceeded to Edinburgh, still further to prosecute his medical studies. While residing at Edinburgh, Dr. Young mixed largely in society, began the study of music, took lessons on the flute, and also private lessons in dancing, and frequently attended performances at the theatre. From this period, he gave up the external characteristics of the Quakers, and ultimately ceased to belong to their body, although he practiced to the end of his life the general simplicity of their moral conduct. During the year 1795, he commenced a tour on the continent, staying at the University of Göttingen during 9 months, in order to prosecute his studies and take a doctor's degree. In February 1797, he came back to England, and was almost immediately after his return admitted a fellow commoner of Emmanuel College, Cambridge. The master of the college, Dr. Farmer, saying as he introduced Young to the fellows, "I have brought you a pupil qualified to read lectures to his tutors." In December 1797, Young's uncle Dr. Brocklesby died, bequeathing to his nephew the sum of £10,000, besides his house, furniture, and a choice collection of pictures. Dr. Young was now entirely at liberty to form his own scheme of life, and he determined to commence practice as a physician, for which purpose, after having completed his terms of residence at Cambridge, he took a house in Welbeck Street, No. 48, which he continued to occupy for 25 years. His practice as a physician, although respectable, was never large. He wanted that confidence or assurance which is so necessary to the successful exercise of the profession. He was perhaps too deeply informed, and therefore too sensible of the difficulty of arriving at true knowledge in the science of medicine ever to form a hasty judgment, while his great love of, and adherence to truth, made him often hesitate where others would have felt no difficulty in expressing an opinion. It was perhaps a happy circumstance for the fame of Dr. Young that this should be the case, as he was thereby enabled to devote a considerable portion of his time to those literary and scientific studies in which so few could compete with him. In 1799, he published his memoir entitled Outlines and Experiments Respecting Sound and Light, which was read before the Royal Society and printed in their Transactions. Other papers, on the theory of light and colors, followed, which the Council of the Royal Society selected for the Bekerean lectures. In the year 1801, Dr. Young accepted the office of Professor of Natural Philosophy at the Royal Institution, which had been established the year previously. The conducting of the journal of the institution was also entrusted to his care, in conjunction with his colleague Sir Humphrey Davy, at that time Professor of Chemistry. Dr. Young remained at the Royal Institution 2 years, during which period he gave a course of lectures on natural and experimental philosophy, a syllabus of which he published in 1802, announcing for the first time his great discovery of the general law of the interference of the undulations of light. His lectures were not, however, popular. They embodied too much knowledge to be intelligible to any considerable portion of his hearers, and the matter was so abundant and the style so condensed that students tolerably versed in science might have found it extremely difficult to follow him in his masterly discussions. Dr. Young had been elected a Fellow of the Royal Society as early as the year 1794, when he had just completed his 21st year. He was now appointed, 1802, Foreign Secretary to the same society, an office which he held during the remainder of his life, and for which he was well qualified by his knowledge of the principal languages of Europe. In 1804 he married Eliza, the daughter of James Primrose Maxwell, of Cavendish Square, and this union is said to have been attended with uninterrupted happiness. His wife, who survived him, left no children. In 1807 appeared his most elaborate and valuable work, a course of lectures on natural philosophy and the mechanical arts, being the embodiment of the 60 lectures delivered while at the Royal Institution, together with the labor of 3 more years occupied in further arranging and improving them. This work comprises a complete system of natural and mechanical philosophy, drawn from original sources, and is distinguished not only by the extent of its learning and the accuracy of its statements, but by the beauty and originality of the theoretical principles. It also contains a disquisition upon the doctrine of interference, in the undulatory theory of light mentioned before, the general law of which he thus enunciates. When two undulations from different origins coincide, either perfectly or very nearly in direction, their joint effect is a combination of the motions belonging to each. Sir John Herschel, speaking of this discovery, says that it alone would have sufficed to have placed its author in the highest rank of scientific immortality, even were his other almost innumerable claims to such a distinction disregarded. Amongst other laborious and difficult matters of investigation, Dr. Young made the first and most important steps in reading the Egyptian hieroglyphics, in which he preceded Champollion, and he afterwards, in 1823, published a work on this subject, under the title of An Account of Some Recent Discoveries in Hieroglyphical Literature and Egyptian Antiquities, including the author's original alphabet as extended by Mr. Champollion, with a translation of 5 unpublished Greek and Egyptian manuscripts. In the year 1808, Dr. Young was admitted a Fellow of the College of Physicians, and in 1810 was elected physician to St. George's Hospital, a situation which he retained for the remainder of his life. In 1813, he published An Introduction to Medical Literature, including a system of practical nosology intended as a guide to students and as an assistant to practitioners. In 1816, Dr. Young was appointed secretary to the commission empowered to ascertain the length of the second's pendulum, and thereby establish a uniform system of weights and measures. 2 years subsequent to this, he became secretary to the Board of Longitude, and on the dissolution of that body, became sole conductor of the Nautical Almanac. Dr. Young at various times contributed 18 articles to the Quarterly Review, of which 9 were on scientific subjects, the rest on medicine, languages, and criticism. Between 1816 and 1823, he wrote 63 articles for the supplement to the Encyclopaedia Britannica, 6th edition, of which 46 were biographical. In the year 1821, he made a short tour in Italy with his wife, and in August 1827 was elected one of the 8 foreign associates of the Academy of Sciences at Paris, in the place of Volta, who died in 1826. The other competitors for this honor being the astronomers Bessel and Olbers, Brown the botanist, Blumenbeck, Leopold, von Buch, Dalton, and Plana the mathematician. Dr. Young's course of life, considered apart from the variety of his occupations, was remarkably uniform. He resided in London from November to June, and at Worthing from July to the end of October, continuing this regular change of residence for 14 successive years. In the year 1826, he removed from his house in Welbeck Street, where he had resided for a quarter of a century, to another in Park Square, which had been built under his own directions and fitted up with great elegance and taste. He continued to live here for the remainder of his life. During the month of February 1829, he began to suffer from what he considered repeated attacks of asthma. His health gradually got worse, but though thus under the pressure of severe illness, nothing could be more striking than the entire calmness and composure of his mind, or could surpass the kindness of his affections to all around him. In the very last stage of his complaint, in an interview with Mr. Gurney, his perfect self-possession was displayed in the most remarkable manner. After some information concerning his affairs, and some instructions concerning the hieroglyphical papers in his hands, he said that, perfectly aware of his situation, he had taken the sacrament of the Church on the day preceding. That whether he should ever partially recover, or whether he were rapidly taken off, he could patiently and contentedly await the issue. His illness continued, with some slight variations, until the morning of the 10th of May, when he expired without a struggle, having hardly completed his 56th year. The disease proved to be an ossification of the aorta, the large arterial trunk proceeding from the left ventricle of the heart. It must have been in progress for many years, and every appearance indicated an advance of age, not brought on probably by the natural course of time, nor even by constitutional formation, but by unwearied and incessant labor of mind from the earliest days of infancy. His remains were deposited in the vault of his wife's family in the church of Farnborough, in Kent. Life of Thomas Young, M.D., etc., by Dr. George Peacock, Dean of Ely. London, 1855. Memoir by Dr. D. Irving, Encyclopaedia Britannica, 8th edition. English Cyclopedia, London, 1858. End of chapter 52.
Chapter 53. of Memoirs of the Distinguished Men of Science of Great Britain, living in the years 1807-1808. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Memoirs of the Distinguished Men of Science of Great Britain, living in the years 1807-1808, by William Walker, Jr. Chapter 53. Joseph Black, Doctor of Medicine. Professor of the Universities of Edinburgh and Glasgow, born 1728, died November the 26th, 1799. Dr. Joseph Black was born at Bordeaux, where his father, a native of Belfast, but of Scotch descent, was settled as a wine merchant, and being a man of engaging disposition and extensive information, was much esteemed by his friend, among whom he reckoned Montesquieu, at that time one of the presidents of the Court of Justice in the province where Mr. Black resided. At the age of 12, Joseph Black was sent to a school at Belfast, where he remained for some years. In 1746, he was removed to the college at Glasgow, and ever afterwards lived in Scotland, which was, properly speaking, his native country. While at the College of Glasgow, he studied under the celebrated Dr. Cullen, then Professor of Anatomy and lecturer on chemistry, and in the year 1751 removed to Edinburgh to complete the course of his medical studies. In the following year, Black made his first great discovery of the cause of the causticity of lime, a property till then supposed to be due to the absorption by the lime of some igneous agency. He placed this question on a scientific basis by ascertaining the chemical difference between quicklime and other forms of the carbonate, and first announced his discovery in a Latin thesis upon the occasion of his taking his degree of Doctor of Medicine in 1754. It was not, however, given in its fullest details until the year afterwards, when he published his celebrated work entitled Experiments on Magnesia, Quicklime, and Other Alkaline Substances, a work which Lord Brougham describes as being incontestably the most beautiful example of strict inductive investigation since the Optics of Sir Isaac Newton. In 1754, as has been mentioned, Black took his medical degree at Edinburgh. In 1756, he was appointed to succeed Dr. Cullen as Professor of Anatomy and lecturer on chemistry in the University of Glasgow. Soon after, however, he exchanged this for the professorship of medicine at the same university, as being more congenial to his tastes. Dr. Black continued at the University of Glasgow for the next 10 years, and it was during this period, between the years 1759 and 1763, that he brought to maturity his speculations concerning heat, which had occupied his attention from the very first commencement of his philosophical investigations. His two great discoveries were the doctrines of latent heat and specific heat. The theory of latent heat, which mainly urged Watt to the adoption of improved arrangements in the steam engine, may be briefly described as the absorption of heat by bodies passing from the solid to the fluid state, and from the fluid to the aeriform, the heat having no effect on surrounding bodies, being therefore insensible to the hand or thermometer, and only by its absorption maintaining the body in the state which it has assumed, and which it retains until the absorbed heat is given out and has become again sensible, when the state of the body is changed back again from fluid to solid, from aeriform to fluid. The doctrine of specific heat, or, as it was called by Dr. Black, the capacity of bodies for heat, is summed up in the facts that different bodies contain different quantities of heat in the same bulk or weight, and different quantities of heat are required to raise different bodies to the same sensible temperature. Thus it was found that a pound of gold being heated to 150 degrees and added to a pound of water at 50 degrees, the temperature of both became not 100 degrees, the mean, between the two, but 55 degrees, the gold losing 95 degrees and the water gaining 5 degrees, because the capacity of water for heat is 19 times that of gold. So twice as much heat is required to raise water to any given point of sensible heat as to raise mercury, the volumes of the two fluids compared being equal. The true doctrine of combustion, calcination of metals, and respiration of animals, which Lavoisier deduced from the experiments of Priestley and Scheele upon oxygen gas, and of Cavendish on hydrogen gas, was founded mainly upon the doctrines of latent and specific heat, and it was thus the singular felicity of Black to have furnished both the pillars upon which modern chemistry reposes. In 1766, Black succeeded Dr. Cullen in the professorship of chemistry at the University of Edinburgh, and in the new scene on which he entered, his talents became more conspicuously and more extensively useful. Dr. Robertson thus characterizes him as a lecturer. He became one of the principal ornaments of the university. His lectures were attended by an audience which continued increasing from year to year. His personal appearance and manners were those of a gentleman and peculiarly pleasing. His voice in lecturing was low but fine, and his articulation so distinct that he was perfectly well heard by an audience consisting of several hundreds. His discourse was so plain and perspicuous, his illustration by experiment so apposite, that his sentiments on any subject never could be mistaken even by the most illiterate. Dr. Black continued to lecture at the University of Edinburgh for 30 years. He then retired and died 3 years afterwards, in 1799. His health, never robust, was precarious at all times from a weakness in the bronchia and chest, but he prolonged life by a system of strictest abstinence, frequently subsisting for days together on water gruel and diluted milk. He was never married. He lived in a select circle of friends, the most illustrious men of the times in science and in letters: Watt, Hutton, Hume, Robertson, Smith, and afterwards with the succeeding generation of Scottish worthies, Robison, Playfair, and Stewart. He was extremely averse to publication, contempting the impatience with which so many men of science hurry to the press, often while their speculations are crude and their inquiries not finished. He never published any work himself, with the exception of his Experiments on Magnesia, etc., and 2 papers, one in the London Philosophical Transactions for 1775 on the freezing of boiled water, the other in the 2nd volume of the Edinburgh Transactions on the Iceland hot springs. Dr. Black expired in the 71st year of his age, without any convulsion, shock, or stupor to announce or retard the approach of death. Being at table with his usual fare, some bread, a few prunes, and a measured quantity of milk diluted with water, and having the cup in his hand when the last stroke of the pulse was given, he set it down on his knees, which were joined together, and kept it steady with his hand in the manner of a person perfectly at his ease, and in this attitude he expired without a drop being spilt or a feature in his countenance changed. His servant coming in saw him in this posture and left the room, supposing him asleep. On returning soon after, he saw him sitting as before, and found that he had expired. Brougham's Lives of Philosophers, London and Glasgow, 1855. Encyclopaedia Britannica, 8th edition. End of chapter 53. Chapter 54 of Memoirs of the Distinguished Men of Science of Great Britain, living in the years 1807 to 1808, This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Memoirs of the Distinguished Men of Science of Great Britain, living in the years 1807-1808, by William Walker, Jr. Chapter 54. Henry Cort. Born 1740, died 1800. The sad history of this great inventor, who has been well surnamed the father of the iron trade, is comparatively soon told. Although his discoveries in the manufacture of iron were so important as to have been one of the chief causes in the establishment of our modern engineering, little is known of the life of the unfortunate inventor. He was born in 1740 at Lancaster, where his father carried on the trade of a builder and brickmaker. In 1765, at the age of 25, he was engaged in the carrying on of the business of a navy agent in Surrey Street, Strand, in which he is said to have realised considerable profits. While conducting this business, Cort became aware of the inferiority of British iron in comparison with that of foreign countries, and entered on a series of experiments with the object of improving its manufacture. In 1775 he relinquished his business as a navy agent and took a lease of some premises at Fontley near Fareham, where he erected a forge and an iron mill. He afterwards took into partnership Samuel Jellicoe, son of Adam Jellicoe, then deputy paymaster of seamen's wages, a connection which ultimately proved the cause of all Cort's subsequent misfortunes. Ford in 1747, Dr. Roebuck in 1762, the brothers Cranege in 1766, and Peter Onions of Merthyr Tydfil in 1783 had all introduced valuable additions to the then known processes of iron manufacture. In 1783-4, Cort took out his 2 patents which, while combining the inventions of his predecessors, specified so many valuable improvements of an original character that they established a new era in the history of iron manufacture and raised it to the highest state of prosperity. Mr. Troughton, in speaking of Cort, remarks, "The mode of piling iron to form large pieces, as described in his inventions, is the one at use in the present day. The method of puddling iron now in use is the same as that patented by Henry Cort. There has been no essential departure from his process. Iron bottoms have been substituted for sand, and by building the furnace somewhat larger, a second charge of cast iron is introduced and partially heated during the finishing operations in the first, as conducted at the present day. All that has been done in the last 73 years has been in the way of adding to and perfecting Cort's furnaces, as experience has from time to time suggested. Cort's method of passing the piled wedge-shaped bars of iron through grooved rollers has been spoken of by another competent authority as of high philosophical interest, being scarcely less than the discovery of a new mechanical power in reversing the action of the wedge by the application of force to 4 surfaces so as to elongate the mass, instead of applying force to a mass to divide the 4 surfaces. The principal ironmasters soon heard of the success of Cort's new inventions, and visited his foundry for the purpose of examining his process, and of employing it at their own works if satisfied with the results. Among the first to try it were Richard Crawshaw of Caerphilly, Samuel Homfray of Penydarren, both in South Wales, and William Reynolds of Coalbrookdale. The first 2 named at once entered into a contract to work under Cort's patents at 10 shillings a ton royalty, and the quality of the iron manufactured by the new process was found to be so superior to other kinds that the Admiralty directed it, in 1787, to be used for all the anchors and other ironwork in the ships of the Royal Navy. The merits of the invention were now generally conceded, and numerous contracts for licenses were entered into with Cort and his partner, by the manufacturers of bar iron throughout the country, and licenses were taken at royalties estimated to yield £27,500 to the owners of the patent. Cort himself made arrangements for carrying on the manufacture on a large scale, and with that object entered upon the possession of a wharf at Gosport belonging to Adam Jellicoe, his partner's father, where he succeeded in obtaining considerable government orders for iron made under his patents. This period, apparently the crowning point of Cort's fortunes, was but the commencement of his ruin. In August 1789 Adam Jellicoe died, and defalcations were found in his public accounts to the extent of £39,676. His papers and books were at once seized by government, and on examination it was found that a sum of £54,853 was owing to Jellicoe by the Cort partnership for moneys advanced by him at different times to enable Cort to pursue his experiments, which were necessarily of a very expensive character. Among the sums advanced by Jellicoe to Cort was found one of £27,500 entrusted to Jellicoe for the payment of seamen and officers' wages. As Jellicoe had the reputation of being a rich man, Cort had not the slightest suspicion of the source from which the advances made to the firm were derived, nor has any connivance whatever on the part of Cort been suggested. The government, however, bound to act with promptitude in such a case, at once adopted extraordinary measures to recover their money. The assignments of Cort's patents, which had been made to Jellicoe in consideration of his advances, were taken possession of, but, strange to say, Samuel Jellicoe, the son of the defaulter, was put in possession of the properties at Fontley and Gosport, and continued to enjoy them, to Cort's exclusion, for a period of 14 years. Notwithstanding this, the patent rights seem never to have been levied by the assignees, and the result was that the whole benefit of Cort's inventions was made over to the ironmasters and to the public, though there seems little reason to doubt that had they been duly levied, the whole of the debt due to the government would have been paid in the course of a few years. As for Cort himself, on the death of Jellicoe he left his ironworks a ruined man. He subsequently made many appeals to government for the restoration of his patents, and offered to find security for payment of the debt due by his firm to the Crown, but in vain. In 1794 an appeal was made to Mr. Pitt by a number of influential members of Parliament on behalf of the inventor and his destitute family of 12 children, when a pension of £200 was granted to him, which he enjoyed until the year 1800, when, broken in health and spirit, he died at the age of 60. He was buried in Hampstead Church, where a stone marks the date of his death and is still to be seen. A few years ago it was illegible, but it has been restored by his surviving son, Richard Cort. Mr. Smiles thus concludes a long and interesting account of Cort in his Industrial Biography. Though Cort died in comparative poverty, he laid the foundations of many gigantic fortunes. He may be said to have been, in a great measure, the author of our modern iron aristocracy, who still manufacture after the processes which he invented or perfected, but for which they never paid him 1 shilling of royalty. These men of gigantic fortunes have owed much, we might say almost everything, to the ruined projector of the little mill at Fontley. Their wealth has enriched many families of the older aristocracy, and has been the foundation of several modern peerages. Yet Henry Cort, the rock from which they were hewn, is already all but forgotten, and his surviving children, now aged and infirm, are dependent for their support upon the slender pittance wrung by repeated entreaty and expostulation from the state. Smiles' Industrial Biography, London, 1863. Mechanics' Magazine, 1859, 60 and 61. End of chapter 54.
Chapter 55 of Memoirs of the Distinguished Men of Science of Great Britain, living in the years 1807 to 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Memoirs of the Distinguished Men of Science of Great Britain, living in the years 1807 to 8, by William Walker, Jr. Chapter 55. James Ivory, Fellow of the Royal Society, etc. Born 1765, died September the 21st, 1842. This distinguished mathematician was born at Dundee, and received the elements of his education in the public schools of that town. His father was a watchmaker, and intended that his son should become a clergyman of the Church of Scotland, for which purpose he sent him, when 14 years old, to the University of St. Andrews. Here Ivory remained for 6 years, and had for his fellow student Mr. after Sir John Leslie, with whom at the end of the above period he removed to the University of Edinburgh, where he remained 1 year to complete the course of study required as a qualification for admission into the Church of Scotland. Circumstances, however, seemed to have prevented Ivory from carrying out the intentions of his father, for on leaving the university in 1786 he became an assistant teacher in an academy at that time recently established in Dundee. After remaining at this academy for 3 years, Ivory, in company with several others, established a factory for spinning flax at Douglastown in Forfarshire. In this apparently uncongenial occupation he remained for 15 years, from 1789 to 1804, but the undertaking proved unsuccessful, and in 1804 the company ceased to exist. Mr. Ivory then obtained the appointment to a professorship of mathematics in the Royal Military College at Marlow, in Buckinghamshire, afterwards removed to Sandhurst, with which establishment he remained until his retirement from public service. This was the most active period of his life, for while fulfilling assiduously the duties of his professorship, he continued unremittingly his scientific studies. His earliest writings were 3 memoirs, which he communicated in the years 1796, 1799, and 1802, to the Royal Society of Edinburgh. The first of these was entitled A New Series for the Rectification of the Ellipse, the second, A New Method of Resolving Cubic Equations, and the third, A New and Universal Solution of Kepler's Problem, all of them evincing great analytical skill, as well as originality of thought. Mr. Ivory contributed 15 papers to the Transactions of the Royal Society of London, nearly all of them relating to physical astronomy, and every one containing mathematical investigations of the most refined nature. The first, published in the Transactions of 1809, and entitled On the Attractions of Homogeneous Ellipsoids, is his most celebrated paper, in which he completely and definitely resolved the problem of attraction for every class of ellipsoidal bodies. Many of Ivory's remaining contributions, ranging through a period of nearly 30 years, related to the subject of the attraction of spheroids and the theory of the figure of the earth, and some of them are considered masterpieces of analytical skill. One of these last subjects which occupied his attention was the possible equilibrium of a spheroid with 3 unequal axes when revolving about one of the axes, a fact which Jacobi had discovered. This Ivory demonstrates in the volume for 1838 of the Philosophical Transactions. The volumes in 1823 and 1838 contain Ivory's 2 papers on the theory of atmospheric refraction, a subject which, next to the theory of attractions, engaged most seriously his attention on account of its great importance in astronomy and the curious mathematical difficulties which its investigation presents. For each of these papers he was awarded the Royal Medal by the Society. Of all his contributions to the Transactions, only one is purely mathematical. This is contained in the volume for 1831, and is entitled On the Theory of Elliptic Transcendence. Besides these contributions to the Royal Society, Ivory wrote several papers in the Philosophical Magazine of 1821 to 27. In Messiris Scriptores Logarithmici, in Leybourne's Mathematical Repository, and in the supplement to the 6th edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica. In the beginning of 1819, Ivory, finding that his health began to decline under the great exertions which he had made in carrying on his scientific researches and performing his duties as professor, resigned his professorship at Sandhurst and retired into private life. In consideration, however, of his great merit, the pension due for the full period of service required by the regulations was granted to him, although that period had not been completed. After his retirement, Ivory devoted himself entirely to his scientific researches, living in or near London until his death. In 1814 he had received the Copley Medal for his communications to the Royal Society. In 1815 he became a Fellow of the same Society. He was also an Honorary Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, an Honorary Member of the Royal Irish Academy and of the Cambridge Philosophical Society, a corresponding member of the Institute of France, of the Royal Academy of Sciences at Berlin, and of the Royal Society of Göttingen. In the year 1831, in consideration of the great talent displayed in his investigations, Ivory was recommended by Lord Brougham, whom he had known in early life, to the notice of the King, William IV, who, with the Hanoverian Guelphic Order of Knighthood, gave him an annual pension of £300, which he enjoyed during the rest of his life, and in 1839 he received the degree of Doctor in Laws from the University of St Andrews. Mr. Ivory attained the age of 77 before his death. He was essentially a self-taught mathematician and spent most of his leisure in retirement. He fathomed in private the profoundest writings of the most learned continental mathematicians, and at a period when few Englishmen were able to understand those difficult works. He even added to their value by many original contributions, and must always be remembered with special interest when the singular destitution of higher mathematical talent, which had reigned in this country for so long a period before his time, is considered. End of chapter 55.
Chapter 56 of Memoirs of the Distinguished Men of Science of Great Britain, living in the years 1807 and 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Memoirs of the Distinguished Men of Science of Great Britain, living in the years 1807 and 8, by William Walker, Jr. Joseph Priestley, Doctor of Laws, born March 24, 1773, died February 26, 1804. Joseph Priestley was the son of a cloth dresser at Burstall Fieldhead, near Leeds. His family appear to have been in humble circumstances, and he was taken off their hands after the death of his mother by his paternal aunt, who sent him to a free school at Batley. There he learnt something of Greek, Latin, and a little Hebrew. To this he added some knowledge of other Eastern languages connected with biblical literature. He made a considerable progress in Syriac and Chaldean, and began to learn Arabic. He also had a little instruction in mathematics, but in this science he did not make much proficiency. Indeed, his whole education was exceedingly imperfect, and excepting in Hebrew and Greek, he never afterwards improved it by any systematic course of study. Even in chemistry, the science which he best knew, and in which he made so important a figure, he was only half taught, so that he presents one of the memorable examples of knowledge pursued, science cultivated, and even its bounds extended by those whose circumstances made their exertions a continued struggle against difficulties which only genius like theirs could have overcome. After studying for some years at the Dissenting Academy founded by Mr. Coward at Daventry, afterwards transferred to London, Priestley quitted Daventry and became minister of a congregation at Needham Market in Suffolk, where his salary never exceeded £30. He had been brought up in the strictest Calvinistic principles, and he very soon abandoned these, and his tenets continued in after life to be those of the moderate Unitarians, whose leading doctrine is the proper humanity of Christ, and who confine all adoration to one supreme being. Priestley's religious opinions proving distasteful to his congregation at Needham Market, caused him to remove in 1758 to Nantwich in Cheshire, where he obtained a considerable number of pupils, which greatly increased his income and enabled him by strict frugality to purchase a scanty scientific apparatus and commence a study of natural philosophy. In 1761 Priestley removed to Warrington, where he was chosen to succeed Dr. Aitken as tutor in the belles lettres at that academy. On settling at Warrington, he married the daughter of Mr. Wilkinson, an ironmaster in Wales, by whom he had several children. His literary career may be said to have commenced here, and having once begun to publish, his appeals to the press were incessant and on almost every subject. The universality and originality of his pursuits may be judged from his delivering at Warrington a course of lectures on anatomy, while his published works during the next 7 or 8 years comprise The Theory of Language and Universal Grammar, 1762, On Oratory and Criticism, 1777, On History and General Policy, 1788, On the Laws and Constitution of England, 1772, On Education, 1765, Chart of Biography, 1765, Chart of History, 1769. During the same period appeared in 1767 his work entitled A History of Electricity, etc., which was so well received that it went through 5 editions. This was followed in 1772 by A History of Vision. In 1767, on account of a dispute with the Warrington trustees, Priestley removed to Leeds, where he became minister of the Mill Hill Chapel, and wrote many controversial books and pamphlets. In after times he wrote Letters to a Philosophical Institution, An Answer to Gibbon, Disquisitions on Matter and Spirit, Corruptions of Christianity, Early Opinions on Christ, Familiar Letters to the Inhabitants of Birmingham, 2 Different Histories of the Christian Church, On Education, Comparison of Heathen and Christian Philosophy, Doctrine of Necessity, On the Roman Catholic Claims, On the French Revolution, On the American War, besides 20 volumes of tracts in favor of dissenters and their rights. His general works fill 25 volumes, of which only 5 or 6 are on scientific subjects. His publications being in all 141, of which only 17 are scientific. When residing at Leeds, Priestley's house immediately adjoined a brewery, which led him to make experiments upon the fixed air copiously produced during the process of fermentation. These experiments resulted in his discovering the important fact that atmospheric air, after having been corrupted by the respiration of animals and by the burning of inflammable bodies, is restored to salubrity by the vegetation of plants, and that, if the air is exposed to a mixture of sulfur and iron filings, its bulk is diminished between 1/4 and 1/5, and the residue is both lighter than common air and unfit to support life. This residue he termed phlogistic air, afterwards called azotic or nitrogen gas, discovered at the same time by Dr. Rutherford of Edinburgh. For these experiments the Copley Medal was awarded to him in 1773 by the Royal Society. The following year to this, from experiments with nimium or red lead, Priestley made his great and important discovery of oxygen gas. This was followed by his discovering the gases of muriatic, sulfuric, and fluoric acids, ammonial gas, and nitrous oxide gas. He also discovered the combination which nitrous gas forms suddenly with oxygen, diminishing the volume of both in proportion to that combination, and he thus invented the method of eudiometry, or the ascertainment of the relative purity of different kinds of atmospheric air. In considering the great merits of Priestley as an experimentalist, it must not be forgotten that he had almost to create the apparatus by which his processes were to be performed. He for the most part had to construct his instruments with his own hands, or to make unskillful workmen form them under his own immediate direction. His apparatus, however, and his contrivances for collecting, keeping, transferring gaseous bodies, and for exposing substances to their action, were simple and effectual, and they continue to be still used by chemical philosophers without any material improvement. Although Priestley was the first to discover oxygen, and thus gave the basis of the true theory of combustion, he clung all his life with a wonderful pertinacity to the phlogistic theory, and nothing in after life would make him give it up. The phlogistic theory explained the phenomena of combustion by supposing the existence of a hypothetical substance termed phlogiston, the union of which with bodies made them combustible, and the disengagement of which was the occasion of combustion. In 1773, Priestley accepted an invitation from Lord Shelburne, afterwards first Marquis of Lansdowne, to fill the place of librarian and philosophic companion, with a salary of £250, reducible to £150 for life should he quit the employment. £40 a year was also allowed him for the expense of apparatus and experiments, and homes were provided for his family in the neighbourhood both of Lord Shelburne's town and country residence. Priestley remained with the Earl of Shelburne for 6 or 7 years, at the end of which period, in 1780, he settled at Birmingham and became minister of a dissenting body there. While residing at Birmingham, he engaged fiercely in polemical writings and discussions, particularly with Gibbon and Bishop Horsley. He also displayed a warm interest in the cause of America at the time of the quarrel with the mother country, and likewise took an active and not very temperate part in the controversy to which the French Revolution gave rise. And having published a reply to Burks' famous pamphlet, he was in 1791 made a citizen of the French Republic. This gave considerable offense to the inhabitants of Birmingham. An ironical and somewhat bitter pamphlet against the High Church party still further excited their feelings against him, and a dinner which was given on the 14th of July to celebrate the anniversary of the attack upon the Bastille became the signal for a general riot. The tavern where the party were assembled was attacked, and although Dr. Priestley was not present, his house and chapel were immediately afterwards assailed. He and his family escaped, but his house, library, and manuscripts were burnt. Although his losses were made up to him partially by an action at law and partially by a subscription among his friends, Priestley felt that he could no longer live at Birmingham. He therefore removed to London and succeeded his friend Dr. Price as principal of the Hackney Academy. He, however, still found himself highly unpopular and shunned even by his former associates in silence. This determined Priestley to leave England, and in the spring of 1794 he withdrew with his family to America and settled at Northumberland in Pennsylvania, where he purchased 300 acres of land. Here he remained the rest of his life, occupied in cultivating his land, in occasional preaching, and in scientific studies. He continued writing and publishing until his death in February 1804, in the 72nd year of his age. He expired very quietly, and so easily that, having put his hand to his face, those who were sitting close to him did not immediately perceive his death. Brome's Lives of Philosophers, London and Glasgow, 1855. Encyclopaedia Britannica, 8th edition. End of chapter 56. End of Memoirs of the Distinguished Men of Science of Great Britain living in the years 1807 and 8 by William Walker, Jr.